Well, if you're not really scared, maybe it's because you're not paying enough attention, or perhaps you're just distracted by all this recovery, consumer confidence rally talk. Seasonal cheer aside, many of this country's leading economists are worried that even a return to pre-crash conditions won't do the trick. So what are the alternatives? Jeff Madrick, a contributor to The Nation and the New York Review of Books, and Rick Wolff, visiting professor in the graduate program in international affairs at the New School, join me next. Welcome, both of you. Glad to have you back. Let's talk quickly about this rally talk. Consumer confidence up, holiday shopping, people are on their sprees again. Are you cheered? Rick?
Not much. If you look at the basics of our economy, the jobs, the prospect for jobs, the condition of the housing market and foreclosures, you have to shake your head at the disconnect between the language of recovery and the reality for the vast bulk of the people, which is not only bad now, but nothing coming down the pike to look like it's going to make it much better.
So reporters just grasping at straws?
Well, you know, I actually think spending is up this Christmas season. I think it's up surprisingly. Reports I hear privately from big-time retailers are that they are stunned. Will it last is the issue. Is this a sort of little eruption of hope? I think I have to reiterate, this economy has a lot to overcome to get back to what it used to be, and what it used to be wasn't good enough. We do need more fiscal stimulus out of Washington. And we got some, in some surprising way. We got a little bit anyway. We're probably going to pay a price for that down the road, however.
The price you're talking about, or rather the little bit you're talking about, has to do with this. Here's Barack Obama from early this month.
First and foremost, the legislation I'm about to sign is a substantial victory for middle-class families across the country. They're the ones hit hardest by the recession we've endured. They're the ones who need relief right now. And that's what is at the heart of this bill.
That's the little bit, not enough?
Well, I don't think it's enough. In a way, people should know Obama pulled a rabbit out of the hat. We thought we weren't going to get any fiscal stimulus. All the talk of austerity economics, the very unfortunate decision to appoint a deficit commission made up of a conservative Democrat and a very, very conservative Republican, at least run by them. All those errors, we got a little bit of stimulus out of it, partly due to the payroll tax cut, and the surprisingly long extension of the unemployment benefits. The unemployment benefits are very welcome. At the moment, I will take any stimulus, but we're going to pay a price for that because it will make it look like the Social Security deficit is bigger. It will give those who want to cut Social Security and ultimately Medicare and Medicaid more ammunition.
I think Jeff's finding the glass half full. You focused on the glass half empty, Rick. In particularly, you focused on what the gains are for the super rich and what it does to the deficit.
Yes, for a very modest gain, and I think Jeff is right, we paid an enormous price. We turned over to the wealthiest people in this country, those who did the best in the last 30 years, those who have come through this crisis the best. We paid them off with an enormous subsidy in terms of their estate tax, of their income tax. That's going to make the budget problem and the deficits bigger, and that's going to be used to impose an austerity on the American people. I think politically as well as economically, this was a terrible overpayment to the wrong people for a very modest gain for those who need it the most. And I think that has to be faced because it's going to come back to haunt Mr. Obama and the rest of us in the years ahead.
This goes to the question that your article in the New York Review that I was very taken with, Jeff, raises, which is that even if the recovery takes us back to pre-08, and you've already mentioned it, are the foundations there for an economy that could come anywhere close to sharing prosperity if the choices we make keep being to expand that gap between rich and poor?
I think it's very important for people to understand, and especially those in the media who have been almost outright deceptive about this until 2007, 2008, that the foundations of the economy have not been good for 30 years. We've neglected education, we've neglected infrastructure, we've neglected energy investments, and the list is a very long one. We've neglected early education, but wages have basically stagnated for 30 to 40 years. The plight of males in particular, though they make more than females for the same qualifications, has been quite extraordinary. It's ahistorical. It is not the American experience. The American experience is persistently rising wages after adjusting for inflation. That's really what the American dream was about. You make more even though you're by and large doing the same kind of work. That ended 30 or 40 years ago. If we go back to that, we'll be in the same hole.
Well, but the dream might have ended, but the idea of it kept on. How did it survive for so long?
Borrowing. The American people were pioneers again, only not by going west, this time by going into debt. And so I would agree with Jeff. I think we're facing an economy which, even if we get back to where we were before this tsunami, economically speaking, hit, we're on a train heading into a wall. That's where we were before. So you have to make much more fundamental changes. Otherwise, getting back to where we were is reproducing what got us into this mess, only it'll happen sooner next time, and to a more exhausted population. We became the most debted working class in America, in the world history, in that binge of the last 30 years. We did more work. Everybody took a second job. Old people came out of retirement. Women went into the labor force. We ended in 2007 when the crisis hit, physically exhausted, strained in our families by everybody working all the time, and at a level of debt that freaked us out as a people. That has to be addressed, and nothing being done now deals with that.
Well, is anyone thinking in new ways? In Europe, are people reassessing more than people are here?
Well, Europe has not neglected some of the foundations as badly as we. Take women working, for example. I think it's great in this period that many women have had an opportunity to have a career, but the government has not helped them remotely adequately to raise a family, to deal with, to maintain their jobs when they take family leaves. There are lots of programs like that in Europe. That's one example of many. But I think it's telling that these austerity programs that are now being recommended by the various fiscal commissions leave almost no room for public investment, almost no room.
And we're hearing from the right and from many of those who are going to be coming into positions of a good amount of power in January, very much the same old mantra. Instead of redistributing, we need to just grow. Take a look at this from Paul Ryan of Wisconsin, who could be heading up the House Budget Committee next year.
Do we believe that the economic pie is fixed and therefore it's the government's role to redistribute the slices more equitably? I would argue that that's sort of the prevailing doctrine that's occurred in the last couple of years. Or do we want to grow the pie so that everybody can increase in their opportunity?
I mean, what are we looking at in 2011 and 2012 if people like this are in decision-making positions? Rick, then?
You know, it's been a fantasy. I'm an economics professor, and it's been a fantasy for 300 years that we're going to avoid dealing with the tough issues that divide us about who gets what by a fantasy about how we're going to grow. Everyone's going to get more, so nobody should be upset. The prognosis for growth in the United States economy is anemic at best. The unemployment makes that the reality we have to live with. We have been in the process for 30 years, as Jeff said, of changing the distribution of wealth. So it's not as though someone now is going to redistribute wealth. We've been doing that for 30 years by having flat wages while productivity exploded the wealth at the top. It's time to correct that because that imbalance of wealth is what got us into this mess. And if we don't deal with that by redistributing, we're not going to get out of it.
But who's pushing for any of this? I mean, you looked at a lot of people writing about the economy, and you came away in your most recent review, Jeff, by saying everyone's kind of fantasizing one way or another.
Well, I agree with much of what Rick says. I think Paul Ryan's comments are remarkably fantastical, because what he's calling for is tax cuts which will somehow enable us to grow our way out of it. That's when all the troubles began. Ronald Reagan preached a similar line. Wages stagnated in the 1980s. The inequality of income grew enormously beginning in the late 70s and basically in the Reagan administration. And we even still had high federal budget deficits. I do think growth is an important component of the way America dealt with its problems, but only in conjunction with social programs that made sure that wealth was shared. Since the Reagan period, and let's not exonerate the Democrats, even since the Carter presidency and through the Clinton presidency, we have failed to develop the social programs to keep that distribution going, and we have not invested adequately in public investment that the private sector simply will not do. I think the outlook is probably more pessimistic even than Rick is describing. We have really failed to develop the foundations for a future economy, and people are not talking about that with urgency.
And what's happening at the bottom? Well, more people going, among other places, to food banks. Here's a report from AFSCME. Take a look.
The economy is so bad that if it wasn't for the food bank, we wouldn't be able to finish out the month with food at all. So, but back when we were working, I never thought that I would even need this much help.
Always knew it was here. I mean, we passed by it, every day. But hey, we were the ones that say, "Hey, man, wow, I'm glad we're not in line at that place." And here we are.
Yeah.
And then we have the plight of workers who are put on furlough, as has been the solution for deficit-strapped states like California. Take a look.
So you're losing all this money. For me, it was like almost $2,000 I was losing the money out of my check. The bill collectors and things, they didn't want to hear, well, the governor's taking my money. All they wanted was their money. I'm in foreclosure, losing my house. I had to make some hard decisions between the bills I could pay. It was either we eat, have utilities and lights and gas, or pay the mortgage. I chose to feed my granddaughter because I'm not letting her starve for a nobody.
You sure you don't want me to cut this out?
And to keep food in the house and so the food won't go bad, I had to pay the utility bills. Okay. So I had to rob Peter to pay Paul. Love you.
Europe, austerity measures are called austerity measures, and they provoke response. A transit strike in Greece as we're speaking, and we've seen similar things in Spain and UK and Ireland. We've talked before about the difference in response here, but really, when it comes to some energy to do any of the things that you've mentioned, where is it going to come from in this year or the next? And really, what are the possibilities for any political leadership in a climate where the financial sector has such influence over our elections and politicians too?
Well, as I tried to explain to the many people who asked this important question, Europe did not suffer over the last 30 years the atrophy of its labor movement the way we did in this country. They have functioning socialist, communist, and other parties that are strong and have large numbers of people supporting them. And whatever you think of their particular politics, this is an infrastructure. These are offices and staffs in cities and towns, and they can mobilize people, and they are mobilizing people, not just for the general strikes that have happened in more European countries in a shorter amount of time than in the history of that continent, to my knowledge. So it's an enormous ferment that's going on there. And if you look, for example, at the polls for the two strongest leaders in the two strongest governments, Sarkozy in France and Merkel in Germany, they're predicted to lose their next elections because the anger over austerity is the #1 political shaping. So the interesting thing is we don't have those organizations, and therefore we can't mobilize what I suspect is a similar view, but that hasn't come to fruition in a way we can see.
Jeff?
I have a book coming out in May called Age of Greed. It's a history of the U.S. economy since 1970. Over that period, America, through a combination of ideological twisting and I think the power of moneyed vested interests, which only grew over this period, has decided that government has no vital purpose. We're not going to correct these problems. And I'm deeply sad about it. I'm deeply sad about people like Paul Ryan. Until we recognize we've got to allow government to get bigger, better managed, and raise tax revenues to support government.
You get the last word. Jeff Madrick and Rick Wolff. You can get more information at our website, grittv.org. Thank you both.